My name is Anna, and for 6 years I wasn't alone in my own body. People call what happened to me a medical mystery or a religious tragedy. But they weren't there in the middle of the night when the air in my bedroom turned into the smell of a shallow grave. They didn't feel the weight. It started in 1968. I was 16, just a normal girl in a small German town. I liked school, I liked the piano. But one night the world broke. I woke up and couldn't move. My chest felt like an invisible man was standing on it, grinding his heels into my ribs. I tried to scream for my mother, but my throat was filled with what felt like cold, wet wool. That was the first time I saw the shadow. It wasn't just a lack of light. It was a hole in reality standing at the foot of my bed. It didn't have eyes, but I knew it was looking at me. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled my blood, that it had been waiting for me to wake up. The doctors called it temporal lobe epilepsy. They gave me pills, Xarontin Tegretol. I took them. I wanted them to work. I prayed they would work. But how do you explain to a man in a white lab coat that the seizures aren't electrical? When the attacks happened, I didn't just shake. I drifted. I would be sitting at my desk and suddenly the classroom would dissolve. The walls would start to bleed a dark, oily substance that smelled like rotting meat. My classmates' faces would melt, their eyes would slide down their cheeks, and their mouths would stretch into these impossible, jagged grins. Fratzen, I called them, demon faces. I'd come back to reality hours later, my fingernails bloody from clawing at the wooden desk with no memory of what I'd said. My teachers started looking at me with fear, not pity, fear. That's when you know you're losing your soul, when the people who love you start backing away toward the door. By 1973, the pills were just poison. They made me drowsy, but the shadow stayed wide awake. I started hearing the clicking. It sounded like a giant insect walking on the floorboards just behind me. Every time I turned around, the clicking would stop. I tried to go to church. I thought the bells and the incense would protect me. But the moment I stepped onto the stone floor of the chapel, the floor felt like it was made of hot coals. The smell of the incense, which I used to love, now smelled like burning hair and sulfur. I looked at the statue of the Virgin Mary, and I didn't see a mother. I saw a hollow shell filled with spiders. I began to hiss. I didn't want to, but the sound ripped out of my throat like a cornered animal. My mother grabbed my arm, her face pale. "Anneliese, stop it," she whispered. But I couldn't. Something inside me was pushing against my teeth, trying to get out. The basement was where I spent most of my time now. The light hurt. The sun felt like it was trying to peel my skin off. I stopped eating because the voices, there were 6 of them now, told me that food was the meat of the dead. I began to do the genuflections. It wasn't a choice. It was a command. I would drop to my knees and stand back up. Drop, stand, drop, stand. I did it hundreds of times an hour. My kneecaps cracked. The sound was like dry branches snapping in a winter wind. The pain was white hot, but it was the only thing that felt real. One night, my father found me in the kitchen. I wasn't at the table. I was on the floor in the corner eating a coal from the fireplace. My mouth was black. My eyes were wide. I looked at him, my own father, and I didn't see him. I saw a piece of meat. I opened my mouth, and a voice that wasn't mine, a voice that sounded like grinding stones and grave dirt, said, "We are not finished with her yet." That was the night my parents stopped calling the doctor, and they started calling the priest. When the church finally agreed to the exorcism, I thought it was the end of the nightmare. I thought Father Alt and Father Renz would walk in with their crosses and their Latin, and the shadow would simply evaporate. I was wrong. The ritual didn't drive the things out. It invited them to speak. In September 1975, the first official session began. I was strapped to a chair in my bedroom. The windows were blacked out. The air was so thick with the smell of my own unwashed body and stale incense that it felt like breathing through a wet cloth. Father Renz held the crucifix in front of my face, and that's when the first other spoke. It wasn't a scream. It was a roar that vibrated the floorboards. My jaw unhinged further than a human jaw should go. I heard my own voice, but it was layered, like 10 people talking at once from the bottom of a well. "We are the ones who do not leave," it snarled. For the next 10 months, we did 67 sessions. Some lasted 4 hours, some lasted 6, and every time they introduced themselves. They were like passengers on a bus that was crashing in slow motion. There was Cain, the murderer, who spoke with a voice like shattering glass. There was Nero, the emperor, who laughed every time I coughed up blood. There was Judas, who hissed about the silver. And then there was the one who didn't have a name, just a low guttural growl that made the crucifix on the wall vibrate until it turned upside down. I watched from the back of my own mind. It was like being a passenger in my own body, watching a monster drive my car into a wall over and over again. I saw my hands reach out and scratch my mother's face. I felt my teeth sink into the flesh of my own arm, tearing away a chunk of skin because the voices said it was the only way to pay for my sins. I looked in the mirror during a brief moment of clarity. My eyes weren't blue anymore. They were black. The pupils had swallowed the iris. I didn't look like a 23-year-old girl. I looked like a corpse that had been left in the sun. This is the part that keeps people awake at night. The priest brought a tape recorder. They wanted proof. If you listen to those tapes today, you'll hear things that physics can't explain. You'll hear me barking like a Rottweiler for 10 minutes without taking a single breath. You'll hear me speaking perfect Latin and Greek, languages I never learned in school. But the worst sound wasn't the demons. It was the sound of me, the real Anneliese, whimpering in the background. A tiny, fading spark of a girl asking for a glass of water, only to be drowned out by a roar of "No water for the filth." By the winter of 1975, I had stopped sleeping entirely. My body was a roadmap of bruises and open sores. I had performed so many genuflections that my knees were just pulp and bone. I would jump 3 feet into the air and land on my knees over and over until the priest had to physically hold me down. I wasn't a human anymore. I was a battleground. By the spring of 1976, I weighed only 68 pounds. My face was sunken, my teeth were loose in my gums, and I was covered in lice because I refused to be washed. The water burned me like acid. One night during the 50th session, the room went ice cold. The candles didn't flicker, they just went out. In the total darkness, the voice that claimed to be Lucifer spoke. It didn't scream this time, it whispered, "She is ours now. The contract is written in her blood. You can pray until your tongues bleed, but she is the sacrifice." Father Alt began to cry. I saw him, the man who was supposed to save me, trembling so hard he dropped the holy water. He realized then that this wasn't just a battle for a girl's soul. It was a war we were losing. I looked at my mother, who was praying in the corner, and for a split second the shadow pulled back. I saw her clearly. I wanted to tell her I loved her. I wanted to tell her to run, but when I opened my mouth, all that came out was a swarm of flies. By June 1976, the house in Liebelfing didn't feel like a home anymore. It felt like a waiting room for the grave. I was no longer a person. I was a 68-pound skeleton draped in bruised skin. My eyes were sunken so deep into my skull that they looked like 2 burnt holes in a sheet. I couldn't walk. I couldn't sit up. My pneumonia was blooming in my lungs like a dark flower, making every breath sound like a wet rattle. But the sessions didn't stop. The priests were convinced that the more I suffered, the closer the demons were to breaking. They didn't see that I was the one who was breaking first. On June 30th, The 67th exorcism took place. I was so weak I couldn't even hiss anymore. My voice had turned into a dry whistle. Father Renz knelt beside my bed, his own face haggard and gray. He asked the others to leave one last time. But there was no roar this time. There was only a terrifying, heavy silence. I looked at my mother. I managed to find enough strength to whisper my very last words to her. I didn't talk about demons. I didn't talk about the shadow. I just looked into her tear-filled eyes and said, "Mother, I am afraid." That night I went to sleep. For the first time in 8 years, the shadow at the foot of my bed didn't growl, it just waited. On the morning of July 1st, 1976, my father walked into my room and found me still. My heart had finally given up. The battleground was empty. The horror didn't end with my death. It just changed shape. The state of Germany charged my parents and the 2 priests with negligent homicide. They called it a tragedy of superstition. The autopsy report was a horror story of its own. My knees were shattered. I had broken ribs, and I had died of malnutrition and dehydration. The doctors argued that if I had been force-fed or hospitalized just 1 week earlier, I would still be alive. During the trial, something happened that still puzzles people to this day. A nun claimed she had a vision that my body had not decayed, that it was incorrupt in the grave. In 1978, 2 years after I was buried, they exhumed my coffin. The official report says my body showed normal signs of decay. But the people who were there, the gravediggers and the witnesses, refused to talk about what they saw. Some say the shadow wasn't in the house anymore. They say it was in the dirt, waiting for the lid to open. If you go to the house in Labelfing today, the neighbors will tell you they don't like to walk past it at night. They say you can still hear the clicking on the floorboards. But the real horror isn't in the house. It's in the 42 hours of audio tapes the priests left behind. If you listen closely to the very last tape, past the screaming and the Latin, you hear a sound that wasn't picked up during the trial. It's the sound of a woman's voice, not mine and not my mother's. It's a voice that sounds like it's coming from inside the microphone itself. It whispers a single phrase over and over while the priests are praying. It says, "We never left. We just went quiet. My name was Anneliese Michel." Some say I was a saint who took on the sins of the world. Some say I was a sick girl failed by everyone who loved her. But as you sit there in the dark watching this, ask yourself one thing. That weight you feel on your chest tonight when you try to sleep. That shadow in the corner of your eye that vanishes when you turn around. Are you sure you're alone?